So on Wednesday night, Diniz decided that he could stay out of the case no longer. Quote, "A human being was dead. I was not satisfied that all pertinent facts had been told, and it was my duty as a representative of the people of my district to demand an inquest." That was July 30th. On July 31st, Senator Ted Kennedy looked tanned, rested, and apparently recovered from whatever injuries he had suffered in his accident when he stepped into a crush of tourists and reporters awaiting his arrival at the Capitol on Thursday morning. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'd like to earn your subscription today. We are continuing our walk through Leo Damore's book, Chappaquiddick. The subtitle is Power, Privilege, and the Ted Kennedy Cover-Up. And it has been fascinating. If you have not joined us for this book, it starts out with the finding of the accident car and walks us through the evidence that is known, which all is found before Ted Kennedy makes a peep. And then it goes through some of Ted Kennedy's maneuverings. Then we get a look at some of the party goings on through the lens of Joey Gargan, who was a primary source for this book. He's also Ted Kennedy's cousin. So it has been fascinating. We have looked at, oh, the UPS driver is here, so the dog is barking. Sorry about that. We have looked at maps. We have looked at road directions and compared those to Ted Kennedy's statements about making a wrong turn on Dyke Road and all of that. It has just been really good. And if you've missed those, I'd encourage you to go back. There's plenty of things that we have covered thus far. But today, we are to the point where Ted Kennedy has just made his speech to the nation, and specifically to the people of Massachusetts. He wanted to basically call them to still support him, and kind of floated like he was just really trying to ascertain what the will of the people would be. But in truth, we're going to see that there may not have actually been any intent on his part to be open to resigning, but he wanted to sound like he was. And so he reads his speech, and we got the perspective initially from Gwen and Jo Kopechne that they were satisfied enough that he had taken responsibility and that he had specifically mentioned her reputation and honored her. And that was what they cared about. And so they were satisfied. So we are at chapter 32. And we're just going to see how much we can get through. So buckle up. Let's see how far we can get. In Edgartown, Russell Peachy identified himself as the room clerk Kennedy had referred to in his television address. Peachy was patrolling the Shiretown end, quote, because regatta weekends can be wild. Peachy had observed Senator Kennedy standing in the shadows at the bottom of a stairway leading to the second floor where his party was being accommodated. Peachy said, "May I help you in any way?" The senator had been disturbed by noises coming from a party next door, he said. "I've looked for my watch and seem to have misplaced it. What time is it?" We'll just stop. To me, this is the clear seeking of an alibi. So do with that what you will, but this particular standing off in the shadows until somebody notices or trying to be noticed and then asking for the time is a clear alibi. Peachy looked through a window to a clock in his office. It was exactly 2:25 a.m. Because the senator appeared somewhat distressed, Peachy asked him, "Is there anything I can do to help you?" Kennedy replied, "Thank you, no," and returned to his room. Peachy called the Colonial Inn to ask the management to quiet the party. He continued patrolling until 4 a.m. He had not seen the senator or any members of the group again that night. Peachy hadn't revealed the conversation before because he had been uncertain it was Senator Kennedy he had spoken to. He said, "The courtyard was lit by floodlights, but there were shadows. I couldn't see very clearly. I wasn't absolutely sure it was the senator." And this is just going to show my age, but I even wrote it down in the margin. It made me think of, in the movie Ever After, and Drew Barrymore's character runs into the prince out in an orchard, and she's mad because he's trying to take her horse. And so she grabs apples and starts throwing them at the prince. And then later her sisters are laughing at her because she didn't know who the prince was. And they say, "Oh, Danielle, you're such a country girl." This made me think of that. Peachy is a country girl. If he does not know who Senator Kennedy is, right? He ought to know. He ought to be able to discern. He says the man he had spoken to was tall and had a Boston accent that sounded like Ted Kennedy. Although at that time, I thought it might have been Gargan's voice. I wasn't sure it was Kennedy then. But after hearing him say on television that he saw a hotel employee, I'm certain now I was the person he saw. I was the only person he could have been referring to. I was the only one around at that time. So I just think it's interesting that he thought it could be Gargan at the time. Very interesting. Peachy believed the senator's explanation. He could have swum the channel. It's impossible to measure a man's strength under such conditions. I hope he stays in the Senate. He's too fine and talented a man for this state or country to lose in high office. On Saturday morning, Peachy posted a notice on the Shire-Torn Inn's bulletin board fully endorsing Senator Kennedy and encouraging him to remain in office. Kennedy had specifically identified a room clerk while in the turmoil of emotional trauma. He couldn't have it both ways. He couldn't be in shock sufficient to prevent him from reporting the accident and also appear to be distressed only about his sleep being disturbed. You can't have it both ways. Either you're in such a peaceful state that you're resting and the sleep is really being disturbed by this party, or you're in such shock you're confused about everything and completely unable to make heads or tails of life. But you can't have it both ways. And so he says, in addition, Kennedy had made no reference to his automobile accident to this clerk, foregoing another opportunity to inform authorities. So that mention of the room clerk in his televised speech brings up more questions, which just keeps happening. Every time Ted Kennedy opens his mouth, it does not allay fears. It does not bring credibility and light. Instead, it just creates more confusion and questions about what in the world happened, Ted. None of us get it. Arena was mystified by Peachy's story. He said, "Where the hell did he get that from? I figured he's giving Ted Kennedy an alibi." By doing so, Peachy was contradicting his police interrogation in which he denied seeing the senator after he had checked in on Friday night. "I probably should have gone back to him after that, but I never did," Arena said. "Once we got through the trial, I figured, it's over." So you've got Arena knowing he already talked to Peachy, and Peachy said he never saw Kennedy. And now Kennedy has gone on television saying he saw a room clerk. And so now Peachy is saying, yeah, I did see him. And I guess it was him. I thought it was Gargan, but I guess it was him. And I think he should stay in office, which does seem like he's just going along with an alibi. I don't know. What do you think? But I can see what Arena's saying. Well, Kennedy's speech left Arena totally confused. He says, because I thought I was going to hear the complete explanation, and that didn't happen. I had his initial statement, and now here is a variation. The variations were considerable. In his police report, Kennedy designated the destination as the ferry landing. In his speech, he failed to mention that, or his controversial wrong turn on Dyke Road, and his unfamiliarity with the area. Completely unmentioned. The police report had omitted mention of the party and the rescue efforts of Gargan and Markham, but revealed that Kennedy had been brought back to Edgartown. In his speech, Kennedy said he swam the channel, one factor that in particular intrigued Arena. Why the hell didn't somebody see Kennedy? Nobody ever came forward to say they saw him coming up out of the water. For the senator to have walked from the landing to the Shiretown Inn unseen on a regatta night suggested a deliberate avoidance of witnesses. Despite his private reservations, however, Arena tells reporters it was a moving and eloquent speech. The senator bared his soul to the country, and you have to admire a man for that. We feel there is no need to go any further into the matter, but Arena is in the minority of feeling that it didn't change a thing. Edgartown is now in the grip of media frenzy. Television cameras are going up and down Main Street and getting all the different resident reactions that they can. It was hotly debated, and the most debated issue was Kennedy's ability to swim the channel. Ferryman Richard Hewitt, you remember him, he says, "I'm not saying it's impossible to make the swim, but I don't believe it. If Ted Kennedy were a normally healthy man and well-rested, there's no question in my mind he wouldn't have even attempted to swim this channel. His speech was a lot of baloney." Yeah, I think Richard Hewitt speaks for all of us. Hewitt had supported Ted Kennedy in past elections, he said, "but I wouldn't vote for him for dog catcher now. How could he leave that girl in the water for 9 hours? A greater threat to Senator Kennedy's credibility was put when John Farrar, remember he's the scuba diver and the captain of the search and rescue team, he is the one who found Mary Jo's body. It says he dove into the ferry channel from the Chappaquiddick side and he swam the distance in 5 minutes. He found it tiring and he said, "A man of Kennedy's swimming ability could probably do it, but I think it was quite a feat based on his physical condition." Farrar was critical of the senator's speech. He didn't answer any questions. He brought on more. And he makes the argument, assuming Kennedy was in shock, why hadn't Markham and Gargan gone to the police? If they were concerned enough to risk diving down into Poocha Pond multiple times in the middle of the night, why wouldn't they take that responsibility? And he says, if the fire department had been called at the time of the accident, quote, "there was a great possibility we could have saved Mary Jo's life. There could have been an airlock in the car. There always is in such submersions. That would have kept her alive. If we had been called, I could have reached the scene in 45 minutes. I say 45 minutes because it was dark." And Damore notes that it had only taken him 30 minutes from the time he got the call until he recovered the body from the accident car. Quote, "That was in the daylight. The lack of light might have caused a delay of 15 minutes. Arena had grown impatient with Farrar's pronouncements. He says John had all this stuff down pat about the air bubble and how long Mary Jo could have lived. The thing that bothered me about it was John didn't know when he went down into that car what he would find. But Arena had to reconsider his opinion in light of a clipping that came from a Boston newspaper 3 days before the Kennedy accident. A New Hampshire woman had spent 5 hours in a submerged automobile. And when the police found her, they were amazed to find her unconscious but still alive in the vehicle. They rushed her to a hospital where she was given respiration, and that an air bubble had indeed saved this woman's life. Arena also starts getting mailed in accounts, one from Salem, Oregon, where a passenger had crashed through a chain and in the Willamette River and had drowned. And when the driver escaped from the car and was able to make it to the shore, that driver was charged with negligent homicide. Carmen Salvador acknowledged, "Chief Arena is getting a lot of letters. They're about evenly divided." Arena is also not amused about the rescue attempt made by Gargan and Markham. He said, quote, "This revelation stunned police, who clearly feel that this information should have been given from the outset. Though Markham and Gargan were both at the police department, neither had given any indication that they had any connection with the accident." So Arena is hacked. And of course, we've talked about this. Arena has nobody but himself to blame. He did not do due diligence on multiple fronts in this investigation. And that is going to continue to be evident. Research later showed that Gargan and Markham indeed had only a moral obligation, but not a legal one, to report the accident. Neither one was liable, and Arena said, quote, "There's no violation on their part of any statute." Time magazine pointed out, while they weren't legally obligated, they could have reasonably been expected to report the accident. A prompt phone call to the police would have saved the senator from any innuendo that would follow, except perhaps if he was drunk. And that suspicion begins to mount, that the only reason why they didn't is because he needed time to sleep off the effects of alcohol, so that that would not be an additional charge brought into this case. Gargan feels, of course, irritated and angry. This has been his response before. "I understood the press didn't know the real situation," he said, "but from my point of view, I did exactly what I thought I should have done and what I would do again." All Gargan was interested in when he dove into Poocha Pond was saving Mary Jo. He said, "I wasn't thinking about the senator's political career at the time, and the press had no understanding of that." My comment is this. His comment is very time specific. Yes, when he dove into Poocha Pond, his only concern was Mary Jo. That may very well be true. If he did indeed dive in, I'm sure it was. But what about after, Joey? What about when stupid Ted goes diving in across the thing and you know he's not dependable? You know perhaps that he's drunk. And you know that there's a girl back there in a car. What is your obligation in that moment, Joey? It's to walk yourself, 100 feet over here to the little shack that's sitting right there. If you're indeed sitting here in the car, you guys picture yourself right here. You're in the car, you and Paul Markham. It's the two of y'all, and the senator just gets out of the car, runs, and dives into the water, and you're both sitting there in shock. And the only thing he said was, "You do your thing, and I'm going to do mine." Well, at that point, if you literally are still wet and you're exhausted from multiple attempts at saving Mary Jo, and your only thought, "All I was interested in was saving Mary Jo," he said. If that's true, then you walk yourself just back over here to a little shack and you dial the number. Ted Kennedy be damned. That's what you care about in that moment. If you care about this woman's life. But that is not all he cared about. I'm not saying that is not true when he was diving in. Yes, when he was diving in, all he was concerned about was Mary Jo's life. But when he's sitting there in the car with Paul Markham and could just walk over here and make a call, or could dive across and swim himself and get himself right over there to the police station, he does neither. He goes back to the cottage and he sleeps, according to his account. Gargan says he may have been the worst person to return to Dyke Bridge with Ted Kennedy because, quote, "We had grown up together. We did that kind of thing, go into the water and try to save people. This was an automatic reaction. When an incident takes place on the water, you don't call the Coast Guard. You better do something damn quick or it might be too late." And that's what we did. If it had been some guy who had come upon the scene all hysterical and ran for the nearest telephone to call the fire department, that isn't helping Mary Jo. That wouldn't have saved her. I mean, that's nonsense. And I guess he's saying that he believed she was already dead. I think the other thing we can say is he actually, if you recall, when he dove in, at one point he puts himself in the car feeling around. It's possible that he reached over and felt a dead ankle. I'm not saying that happened, but that's the only other instance in which doing nothing in the moment after you get out of the vehicle makes any sense at all. He is saying with absolute certainty that wouldn't have saved her, but how do you know? You were crazy enough to dive in multiple times to try to save her. So unless you actually felt a dead ankle, then why aren't you doing everything in your power to try to save a young lady? That makes no sense. Gargan observed, the senator never did actually say in so many words that when he jumped into the water, he told Paul and me that he was going to report the accident. He wasn't in shock at that point. To Paul and me, when somebody says, "I'll take care of it," we presumed that's what he was going to do. It wasn't our position to report the accident. And Damore tells us legally Gargan was on solid ground. Nothing under the law would criticize what they did. Gargan says everybody is saying those two guys are SOBs and this and that. Granted, we may be, but there's no liability under the law in being an SOB. Well, there's certainly liability morally, isn't there? Well, now Edmund Diniz, the DA, agrees that the press briefings that they had been unwise. He feels that the explosion of publicity makes it to where no one could get a fair trial. And Walter Steele, and he also says that the autopsy should have been performed. Walter Steele takes real offense at this. He's angry, and he says it's really easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. But Steele says that basically an autopsy in this matter would have only resulted in the unnecessary surgical mutilation of the body of a blameless girl. So he feels they were absolutely right to not do an autopsy. Diniz is starting to doubt that decision. If Edgartown is suffering all of a sudden from debate and theorizing, the senator is faring much better. At this point, after his televised statement, an estimated 10,000 telegrams were delivered to Hyannisport compound, where all the Kennedys are holed up and all of the Kennedys' men. And they were running 100-1 in favor of the senator remaining in office. The editorial response to the speech, however, was harsh. Kennedy, according to the Baltimore Sun, said he was a man who had failed badly in long hours, not just a moment of crisis. The senator had given no real explanation. And so another paper said further investigation may be necessary. But also, because Kennedy referenced the health of my wife, his office starts getting questions about whether or not she's pregnant. And Kennedy says, just say she's pregnant. She's expecting a baby in February. But Drain, his administrative assistant, feels like, I don't know, or I think it's his press secretary actually. Press secretary Dick Drain says, I don't know, I don't want to seem like we're trying to get sympathy. But eventually, after people are hounding his office, he says, yes, on Saturday, he tells them Joan Kennedy was expecting a baby in February. And Rose Kennedy now gives a little statement. She's on the defensive, and she gives an interview at the compound. And here's the quote. She says, Teddy has been so magnificent under a tremendous strain which people don't know about. He has been overly conscientious about his father and about me and about Ethel, in addition to his own obligations. He has been so faithful in caring about us all. It really has been unfair, the burden. Mrs. Kennedy wrote to the Kopechnes also, telling them that having experienced the death of her own daughter at the same age, she understood their suffering. Quote, and how badly I felt that my son was in any way involved in their loss and that my sympathy and prayers were with them. She's referencing Kick, which, if you remember, this is the daughter that she had cut off and had nothing to do with. She refused to attend her wedding. She didn't have any contact with her. She had essentially cut her off and disowned this daughter. So she did not understand and sympathize with their loss. She had had nothing to do with their daughter, with her daughter, and they had been in connection regularly with their own daughter. They had spoken with Mary Jo just days before and had heard all about her life plans, and they were close with her, so it's not at all the same situation. Mrs. Kennedy echoed the chords of a familiar family mythology. I've always brought my children up with the idea that you have ordeals and triumphs. She explained, God does not send us a cross any heavier than we can bear. How you cope is the important thing, not the events themselves. I'm sure Ted can rise above all this. So, before I get into the observations for chapter 32, I just want to say that this is actually completely unbiblical. This quote, God does not send us a cross any heavier than we can bear, is extra biblical. It's nonsense. It's not from the Bible at all. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is the place where I think people are getting this idea, and I just want to talk about it very quickly. It says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. So this verse is actually not talking about the cross we bear or the burdens we have in our lives at all. It's talking about the temptation towards sin. And it's saying that temptation is common to everybody. Everybody has sin that they are pulled toward or tempted by, but that God will never let you be tempted beyond the ability of you to escape giving into sin. He's not going to put you in a situation where you have no outs for sin. And so with temptation, he provides a way of escape. So that's what that's talking about. It's talking about sin. It's not talking about the burdens that we bear. I know that might seem like not a Chappaquiddick message, but I'm a Christian reading Chappaquiddick, and I do want to look at that idea with a critical lens and say, this is not actually a Christian idea. So that's that. The observations for chapter 32 are, when Peachy and the hotel situation happened, the whole thing actually seems like Ted is seeking an alibi, or it's completely untrue and Peachy is just going along with it. So we can't tell which, but regardless, it's sus. Arena is now noting many variations between Ted Kennedy's statements to the police and to the television audience. He notices the ferry landing as the intended direction is a different statement, that there was a wrong turn is not mentioned, that there was a party is suddenly mentioned, that there are rescue efforts that's suddenly mentioned, and then that he swam. So those are all variations that Chief Arena is noticing. Farrar criticizes and tests the channel swim, and he says that Mary Jo could have been saved. And then Paul Markham and Joey Gargan are brought under fire, and ultimately they were immoral but not liable for not reporting the accident. The Edgartown residents are largely condemning Ted, but the public largely supports Ted. And so that's all very interesting. Joan's pregnancy is announced, and then Rose Kennedy makes statements for the first time. So we are just one chapter in, and that is not a good start. So I'm going to try to hurry. Chapter 33. The senator's first public appearance since the broadcast was also calculated to subdue the negative response. That the press had been tipped off in advance was evident by a company of photographers awaiting the arrival of the Chevrolet convertible driven by Joan Kennedy that pulled into the parking lot of St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannis on Sunday morning. Of course, he's going to church. They use religion like a cloak, and it has nothing to do, just like I was just talking about with Mrs. Kennedy, it has nothing to do with genuine faith. It's all a facade. Now, for Mrs. Kennedy, I think there was some genuine belief mixed with odd beliefs, and I don't know as much about her, but for Ted, this is a complete political calculation. Kennedy got out of the car to absolute silence, and then a scattering of applause began to build. A voice called out, "We're with you, Ted." Kennedy walked with his head bowed into the church. The mass concluded with America the Beautiful, and Monsignor Thompson specifically explained, "Today we used that song in tribute to Senator Kennedy." So there we have the marrying of faith and public service, or church and state, however you want to say it. The senator's exit provoked another outburst from an unruly crowd. Another demonstrator greeted Kennedy's return to Hyannisport. Circling about the post office, 17 college-age Youth for Truth carried hand-lettered signs that said, "Can you buy justice?" and "Swim, don't run in 72. This group was disgusted, dismayed, and shocked by the senator's speech. So they went to protest. Kennedy spent his afternoon on board the Marlin. The yacht was anchored for a picnic, and then Kennedy returned to the compound. Press editorial folks are universally condemning his speech, saying it was emotionally charged, and there's an editorial furor across the nation, but specifically in the Northeast. People are angry. They're accusing him of delaying reporting, that he deliberately sacrificed whatever slight chance there might have been to save Mary Jo Kopechne, and that it's all just an exercise in emotions. There's calls all over the country for him to resign, etc. Registrar Richard McLaughlin chose Sunday evening to announce that Kennedy's license was being revoked for an indefinite period. So Kennedy had to come to a statutory hearing on Wednesday, August 6th. McLaughlin said, "We are interested in his functions at the wheel, what happened immediately before the accident. We are trying to establish the level of performance. This hearing could find serious fault or no serious fault, but nothing in between. So it would be decided that either he had committed serious fault in his driving or that there was no serious fault." McLaughlin denied that there was favorable treatment being granted to Senator Kennedy, and he actually was cited as the finest registrar the state has ever had. He had sought out on a mission to rid the state of drunk drivers, and he even had recommended that legislation be introduced to reduce from 0.15% to 0.10% for their alcohol blood levels, the level at which drivers were considered too drunk to operate a vehicle. McLaughlin had charged that courts were too lenient. So he really was a registrar that was trying to do what was in the interest of drivers. His private opinion of the Kennedy accident was even more severe than what he had said publicly. He said, "Leaving the scene of an accident and delaying a report for more than 9 hours, for all practical purposes, foreclosed a drunk driving charge." He says, "It effectively deprives officers of the evidence of chemical testing and direct observation. So if you want to avoid a drunk driving charge after an accident, that is how you do it." Yes, obviously. 12 sacks of mail were delivered to Kennedy's Boston office, and they were running heavily in favor of the senator. Drain had nothing to say, and he just keeps referencing the counts of telegrams and mail that were all in favor of the senator. Drain refused to identify any of the vehicles that were mentioned in the statement that Kennedy had made. And Gargan finds Look's story puzzling. There's a discrepancy, of course, because of what Ted Kennedy has said versus what Huck Look had said. And so Gargan is referencing that and saying, at the time that Look said he saw the senator, I'm convinced under all of the circumstances that Paul and I had to be swimming under the water. So he's saying when Huck Look is over here at the intersection spotting a vehicle, we were already over there time-wise diving in the water. Gargan is not as upset as the senator's lawyers are, and he says, I just thought Look was wrong. He's just mistaken about when he saw a vehicle. Gargan is now being pursued by the press, and Betty Gargan, his pretty diminutive wife, was furious to find a CBS reporter at her door. She starts yelling at him, "Get off my porch and leave this yard. I don't want to see you again." And Gargan thought it was awfully funny that his wife chased CBS News off their property. Outrage at the vilification that had been leveled at her husband, she was even more incensed by the way that the young women at the party had been treated. It says, quote, she wanted to go on a talk show. This is Gargan talking. He says, she wanted to go on a talk show and give everybody a blast because the press had been so unfair to the girls about this whole thing, to say what nice girls they were. So she is aching to get on TV, is what Joey is saying, to defend the young women in the boiler room. Gargan only could concur. He says, the truth was these were girls of the highest reputation who I liked very much. They had been very loyal to Bobby, and the purpose of the reunion was to talk about the campaign the year before. That was strictly the limits of that particular party. Gargan was sick of reading about 6 men and 6 girls at the party. He said other people who had worked campaigns were supposed to be there and just didn't show up. So it could have been 10 fellas and 8 girls or vice versa. It was all as willy-nilly as that. Gargan starts getting withering characterizations of him by the press, but he says, I can't change anything and I'm not going to put out more statements. A telegram delivered to the Kennedy compound was immediately made public on Monday afternoon. It said, "The Democratic congressional delegation from Massachusetts strongly urges you to retain your seat in the U.S. Senate. We pledge to you our continued friendship, support, and cooperation." All the Democrat congressmen from Massachusetts had signed that telegram. In New Bedford, others are saying that if they wanted to register their support, they could sign a petition. So then a New Bedford radio station promptly demands that a second petition be made available for all who wanted Senator Kennedy to resign. The editorial said a petition was needed because of the, quote, "inescapable conclusion that the overriding consideration that motivated Edward Kennedy during those tragic hours was the effect this event would have on his public image and his career. What was at risk here was the Kennedy image. Balanced against it was the life of a girl." So, Chapter 3 observations are: Ted goes to church and the crowd cheers. Editorials nationwide call for Ted to resign. Registrar McLaughlin revokes the license and has a hearing scheduled for August 6th. Gargan contradicts Look's time and insists that's the time they would have been in the water. Democratic congressmen from Massachusetts support Ted Kennedy, and the public has mixed reactions. Chapter 34. Having failed to resolve the suspicion and doubt attached to the accident, the lid that Kennedy's advisors hoped to place on the episode was threatening to be lifted by demands for a new investigation. The most dangerous of these was coming from a grand jury foreman named Leslie Leland. A young pharmacist, earnest and conscientious, he requested a conference with Diniz and Attorney General Robert Quinn. The press was putting so much pressure on him, he said, to call for an investigation. But he learned that the grand jury had no legal right to call for an investigation. Quinn's advice was kind of faulty, though. The grand jury had the right to investigate any matter it wanted to. All Leland had to do was file a written request with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, asking for the grand jury to be reconvened. A grand jury investigation required Diniz to present evidence of a specific crime against a specific defendant. So, should the grand jury indict Ted Kennedy, Diniz would be stuck with prosecuting the case. And to head off the grand jury and retain control over the case if it should come to that, Diniz began now exploring other options. Armand Fernandez says that had those attending the party at Chappaquiddick talked to police instead of sneaking off Martha's Vineyard, no further investigation would have been necessary. But the effort to conceal the party and what had gone on before and after the accident was what brought about all the suspicion in this case. Diniz assigns Lance Garth to begin researching the statutes on inquests. An inquest was the only procedure short of a grand jury or a trial in which testimony under oath could be obtained. Used when questions arose about the circumstances of a death, an inquest was conducted by a judge with the power to subpoena witnesses, hear testimony under oath, and consider investigative reports. The judge would then make a finding of facts as to how the person met his death and report to the Supreme Court whether or not criminal proceedings were warranted. The judge's determination could be accidental death, criminal negligence, conspiracy to hide the facts, or the report could draw no conclusions at all. But if the judge did find fault, such as negligence, and the person charged in the report with the commission of the crime was at large, the magistrate would issue the process for the arrest. So it could result in an arrest. The inquest report could be used as a basis for bringing a case before the grand jury, or it could be ignored. And all of this suits Diniz just fine. He thinks this is the right matter of action rather than going through a grand jury report. Now, George Killen is pretty angry, and he's demanding to know what crime Diniz is seeking to prove by asking for this inquest. Diniz insists he is not looking to hang a rap on Ted Kennedy. He's considering this inquest in order to gain access to the witnesses who had attended that party. If people had submitted sworn statements at the time of the accident, the purpose of a new investigation would be questionable. But Diniz is considering entering the case because the press is on my back to do something. Killen says, to hell with the press. Look what they did to Arena. Unsatisfactory as the explanation of the accident was, it was likely to be all Ted Kennedy and his friends were prepared to say about it. Kennedy was going to resume his seat in the Senate. Why revive this whole thing? Killen had 169 other cases that he was currently preparing for the special criminal sitting of the Superior Court, and he was not interested in reopening this investigation about the Kennedy accident. That Killen is downgrading the Kennedy case and counseling Diniz to stay out of it was good advice, according to Frank Keating. If Diniz was finding his decision to enter the case difficult, indecisiveness was now epidemic at the Kennedy compound. The election returns were winning emotional public support, but Kennedy's contrived, blatantly emotional speech had, quote, done him more harm than good with political professionals and with the press. So Kennedy had left so many questions unanswered by his statement that everybody's saying no fair assessment can even be made. We don't even know if he should resign because he didn't give us enough information about any of it. It had been as indefensible for him not to have offered a full explanation now as it was not to have reported it in the first place. Everyone still is questioning his judgment, not only in the original action, but also now in offering this statement that really answers no questions at all. Political observers, however, doubted that Kennedy could be defeated no matter what, because he was a Kennedy and could get away with anything, even the death of a young woman under mysterious circumstances. Democratic Congressman Emanuel Seller of Brooklyn says that he thought Kennedy's post-accident behavior had knocked him out permanently of any kind of presidential contention. He says, I think the nation itself has come to realize he is not a shining white knight. Indeed, he is not. And before Chappaquiddick, Senator Edmund Muskie said, Kennedy could have had the nomination for the asking, but this controversy may have brought about an unfortunate shift in his fortunes. He did note, though, I would never count a Kennedy out of anything. So at this point, he thinks he's done, but even somebody who's pretty sure that this has changed your fortunes says, well, he is a Kennedy. So as long as Kennedy remained silent, they all felt he risked a hostile press. The collapse of Ted Kennedy's presidential chances was suggesting a possible escape route. A poll published by the Boston Globe said that 78% of Massachusetts voters wanted him to retain his Senate seat. As presidential preference, however, Kennedy's position had dropped from a pre-accident high of 72% to now just 55%. Advisors at the compound were starting to think that the first step toward a political rehabilitation would be to take himself out of presidential contention for 1972. They have to make a decision because editorials and cartoons are getting worse and worse and labeling him all sorts of names. There is mockery, talking about panic, poor judgment, and the surge of public support is starting to tip over. Kennedy's appeal to constituents had reduced the credibility of his resignation talk. The longer he hovers in indecision, the less likely it is that anyone believed he was even considering resigning. A source close to the decision later said that this had all been a Kennedy-created sham. He says there was never any essential doubt about his resignation. It was just a matter of the timing about the statement of when he would return to the Senate. This person says Kennedy had determined from the start, I've just got to gut this thing through, which fits with what Rose was saying just last chapter. So yeah, chapter 34 observations are, an earnest grand jury foreman is prodding around for an investigation. Diniz begins digging into regulations about inquests. Killen does not want to reopen an investigation, and the editorials are against Ted. The public opinion is starting to tip and turn. Insiders begin to realize Ted may never be president, and also say that he never actually contemplated seriously resigning from the Senate. We'll go through chapter 35 today, and then I think that will be it. Of the first 400 letters opened at the senator's Boston office, only 3 or 4 were anti-Kennedy, an aide revealed. Because the senator had expressed the wish to see everything that came into the office, the mail was being forwarded to Hyannisport, and he was heartened and encouraged. Kennedy now ended his self-imposed exile, boarding a plane to fly to the funeral of Burke Marshall's father. You remember he had passed away early on in the days of Chappaquiddick. And right then, when he goes to this funeral, Ted's Boston office distributes copies of a statement. This is the statement on July 30th. Senator Edward Kennedy is returning to Washington to resume his duties as U.S. Senator and Assistant Majority Leader. He is grateful to the people of Massachusetts for their expressions of confidence and expects to submit his record to them as a candidate for re-election in 1970. If re-elected, he will serve out his entire 6-year term. Of course, Dick Drain, his press secretary, starts getting questions, and Kennedy did not plan to hold a press conference about this statement or about the accident. Joseph Kopechne approved of Kennedy's decision to return to the Senate, but considered the week of silence ill-advised. I think he was getting poor advice, I really do. Kopechne still hadn't really come to grips with his daughter's death. He said, "I still can't believe it's happening, even now. It's like watching a TV program and turning it off and it's all over." Gwen Chappaquiddick noted that she was still thinking of her daughter in the present, not in the past. "We still expect her to come home, to walk through that door. We haven't had time to think. And when it really hits us, it will be too late." Mrs. Chappaquiddick said she did not hold the senator personally responsible and harbored no hard feelings. "Mr. Kopechne and I can form no hate for anyone. There's always something good in a person, no matter what his faults. Nothing can help us with our daughter now. No one can bring her back or console us. This could have happened to any one of those girls. It just so happened it was Mary Jo. It was an unfortunate accident. We want to believe this." Isn't that interesting? Senator Kennedy's return to the Senate had left Edgartown sort of like a tourist trap now. Portions of Dyke Bridge had been broken away for souvenirs. Tourists are now coming up to pose for snapshots of the Lawrence cottage, and reporters are now returning for second look stories in their newspapers. Everyone, of course, was bothered and intrigued by the fact that none of the facts add up to a complete picture. No one feels that they have any certainty about how things happened, when they happened, or what exactly happened. Kennedy's intention not to say more about the incident brings new and heavy pressures on the DA's office. Diniz had been deeply troubled. He said Mrs. Kopechne was dead. Senator Kennedy said he was involved. "I had a choice of conducting an investigation myself or letting the local authorities do it. But as the days went by and no new information came to light, I began to distrust my own motives. I began to ask myself if my admiration of the Kennedys and my sympathy for Senator Kennedy's personal situation were preventing me from carrying out my duty as DA. Clearly, I had to call my own courage into account. So on Wednesday night, Diniz decided that he could stay out of the case no longer. Quote, "A human being was dead. I was not satisfied that all pertinent facts had been told, and it was my duty as a representative of the people of my district to demand an inquest." That was July 30th. On July 31st, Senator Ted Kennedy looked tanned, rested, and apparently recovered from whatever injuries he had suffered in his accident when he stepped into a crush of tourists and reporters awaiting his arrival at the Capitol on Thursday morning. Reporters wanted to know if the statement released the previous day meant he had eliminated himself as a president candidate for 1972. "That's right. I intend to fill out my full term if re-elected," Kennedy said, and he brushed aside other questions to hurry up the Capitol steps. The majority leader, Mike Mansfield, comes and takes Kennedy's arm, escorts him up to the front row's whip's desk, a ritual of re-entry as obvious to those crowded into the gallery as was the senator's subdued and ill-at-ease manner. Jimmy Smith, you remember, was a Kennedy man, and he said he regretted that it looked like the presidency was going to be the price of this mismanagement of the crisis. But he said, "I'm glad you're back at work and the ordeal is over." He wrote Kennedy on Thursday expressing how I feel and where I stand, and that you know you can count on me now and any time in the future. Smith wanted Kennedy to know that Ed Diniz really had proved to be a true friend. "I'll explain more when I see you." But Smith's assurances that day were hollow. He did not know that Diniz had made the decision he had the night before to reopen the investigation and ask for an inquest. On that day of Smith's soothing letter to Ted Kennedy, Diniz was asking the Chief Justice of the Superior Court to assign a judge, quote, to conduct an inquest into the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, who supposedly died by external means on or about July 18th, 1969. Word of the reopening of an investigation into the accident at Chappaquiddick struck Kennedy's office like a thunderbolt, only hours after the senator had resumed his seat. Dick Drain learned of the Diniz letter when the Boston chief of the Associated Press telephoned him for, quote, reaction. Kennedy, when he was called from the Senate floor and told about it, was reported to have blown his top at the revival of the crisis that he thought had been disarmed. So, Chapter 35's summary are these. Ted Kennedy attended a funeral, and simultaneously his office released a statement that he would be going back to the Senate. Joe and Gwen Kopechne are supportive and still clearly in shock. Edgartown is getting lots of tourists now and kind of getting torn apart, splinter by splinter. DA Diniz decides to reopen the investigation. July 31st, Ted re-enters the Senate office and responsibilities. And then Ted blew his top when he hears that the investigation will be revived. That is the end of Chapter 35. I believe that gets us through 4 chapters today. I had hoped to get through more, honestly, but we're just going to go through at the pace we can get through. This book is fantastic. We are now well past the halfway mark, and we are going to keep going through this and learn what this investigation shows, and also how this whole thing resolves with the inquest, with testimonies from the boiler room girls. This is going to be interesting. I want to let you guys know, if you missed some of them, last week we went through the JFK Look magazine telling of William Manchester's book, The Death of a President. Tomorrow, and hopefully for all of this week, we are going to be going through Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. And I want to invite you to join me. This story is a fascinating story about a poor young lady named Fanny Price who was raised in poverty, and she gets invited to go live at her wealthy cousin's home. She ends up falling in love with one of her cousins, but through a series of course, romantic mishaps, the person she falls in love with is in love with others, and she is a keen observer of character and morality, and she sees them all very clearly. And woven into this story are themes of class, themes of slavery, all sorts of interesting topics. I think you're not going to want to miss it, and I'm hoping that this will be a really wonderful story for us all to enjoy during the week of Thanksgiving, that we can just immerse ourselves in a wonderful story by Jane Austen, and then move on to other things after the week of Thanksgiving. So please join me for this book, and I will hope to see you back each day this week. Have a great day. Bye.